Imagine a student hands in a test, and at the top of the page is a score, 30 out of 40. This is a raw score. It represents a simple tally of correct answers. And on a standardized test, a raw score operating in isolation provides zero practical information about what a student actually knows. The immediate challenge for educators sitting across the desk from parents is translating this static number into an actionable picture of academic progress. To solve this, psychometricians have built three distinct statistical translation engines: percentiles, grade equivalents, and scale scores. These three frameworks all rely on a concept called relative interpretation. They do not measure a student's absolute mastery of a specific subject. Instead, they measure how that student stacks up against a specific group of other test takers. We are going to deconstruct the internal mechanics of these three engines to expose the statistical assumptions driving them, assumptions that routinely mislead educators, parents, and policymakers. Understanding the rigid mathematical architecture beneath these metrics is the only way professionals can separate aggressive testing market claims from actual diagnostic reality. The first and most common translation engine is the percentile. A percentile functions entirely by comparing a student's raw score to the scores of a previously tested cohort, known as a norm group. This graph illustrates a typical norm group of 3,000 students, forming a bell curve. The vast majority cluster right in the middle. This clustering effect leaves only a tiny fraction landing at the extreme ends, earning very high or very low scores. To calculate where a single student ranks within this curve, statisticians use standard deviations. A standard deviation measures the average distance between individual scores and the mean of the entire group. Standard deviations slice the normal curve into precise percentages. 68% of scores fall within one standard deviation from the center. These rigid buckets dictate the final output. A student's mark assigns a percentile rank, indicating exactly what percentage of the norm group they outperformed. But there is a mathematical vulnerability built into this comparison. The meaning of a percentile shifts wildly depending on how tightly packed or widely spread the scores in the norm group are. This table compares two fictitious tests with an identical mean of 5.0. The homogeneous group's standard deviation is 1.1. The heterogeneous group's is 3.2. Because of this variance, an identical raw score yields completely different percentile rankings, since the crowd spread dictates the rank. This reveals a persistent trap in educational reporting: the discrepancy between national and local norms. A student answering 20 questions correctly might sit at the 50th percentile nationally, but jump to the 75th percentile locally, simply because the local test takers did not perform as well on average. A percentile rank is not a fixed measure of a student's intelligence or capability. It is a highly volatile ranking, entirely dependent on the statistical makeup of the specific crowd used for comparison. The second engine is the grade equivalent score. This metric attempts to map a test performance onto a developmental continuum spanning months and school years. This bar chart displays the foundational data used to build these scores. We see the actual average performances of students administered an 80-item test in the 4th, 5th, and 6th grades. These bars represent real, concrete average scores from those specific middle grades. Yet, score reports routinely hand out grade equivalents for grades 2, 3, 7, and 8. How do test developers assign scores to students in grades that never actually took this specific test? They draw a trend line through the actual data points from grades 4, 5, and 6, extrapolating outward in both directions. The remaining performance bars are merely statistical ghosts, interpolated estimates assuming content mastery increases at a perfectly constant rate over time. This interpolation leads to the emeritus professor fallacy, where parents see a high grade equivalent score and demand their child skip grades. But a 4th grader scoring a 7.5 hasn't mastered 7th grade math. Their test contained absolutely no 7th grade mathematical concepts. A 7.5 simply estimates how an average 7th grader in the 5th month of the school year might have performed if they were forced to sit down and take a 4th grade test. Grade equivalents measure a student's current developmental velocity relative to their peers. They estimate speed. Using them to dictate absolute academic placement is statistically baseless and structurally dangerous. The final modern engine relies on item response theory, or IRT, which generates scale scores. These are designed to account for varying difficulty levels across multiple forms of a test. Statisticians convert raw scores, like our 30 out of 40, into a new arbitrarily chosen numerical track, scaling from 500 to 900. By evaluating every question's properties, test makers create vertical scaling, stocking tracks cleanly from kindergarten through 12th grade. Vertical scaling is incredibly appealing to policymakers. It allows them to track longitudinal student growth on a single continuous numerical line over a decade of schooling. But there is a massive structural compromise required to make vertical scaling mathematically possible across that span of time. For a vertical scale to function correctly, every single test item must correlate heavily to one global unitary trait. In a math test, that trait is a generalized concept of mathematical comprehension. This strict mapping to a global trait strips items of specific nuances. It prevents diagnosing the granular subskills a student is actually missing. If a standardized test boasts a longitudinal vertical scale, its mathematical architecture structurally prevents it from providing the precise diagnostic data teachers actually need to make daily instructional decisions. Percentiles, grade equivalents, and scale scores serve a specific purpose. They are highly valid for executing relative, macro-level normative rankings across districts and states. But because they rely on trendline estimations, norm group volatility, and unitary trait scaling, the mathematics behind these systems prohibit them from effectively guiding classroom instruction. To bridge those actual learning gaps, we have to pivot. Data from 4,000 separate investigations shows that when teachers use assessment-elicited evidence to constantly adjust their instructional means to ensure they reach curricular ends, the impact is profound. In fact, this process of real-time adjustment can effectively double the speed of student learning, provided we move beyond the limits of relative measurement. Standardized architectures are rigid and linear. The alternative, formative assessment, is a dynamic, continuous, circular feedback loop. The formative loop requires the continuous collection of evidence by the teacher, leading to immediate instructional adjustments in real time, and allowing students to actively shift their learning tactics. Formative assessment is an absolute means-ends instructional process. It evaluates whether specific curriculum goals are being met, completely insulated from the statistical distortions of an outside norm group. Standardized tests are designed to measure the shadow of learning for the sake of accountability. Formative assessment actively builds the substance of learning right there in the classroom.